22-year-old Madison Brooks walked into the Suffolk County Courthouse, wearing a carefully chosen pale blue dress and a practiced expression of wounded innocence, her eyes glistening with manufactured tears as she gazed at the jury. She had spent months perfecting the role of the grieving victim, confident that her beauty, her youth, and her calculated vulnerability would be her salvation. But the mask she had worn so skillfully was about to be ripped away, not by the prosecutor's evidence, but by the one witness she never expected to take the stand against her, her own best friend, the only person who knew the truth behind the carefully constructed lie that had sent an innocent man to prison and nearly destroyed him completely. The morning of March 3rd dawned cold and gray over the coastal town of Harborview, Massachusetts, a picturesque New England community where white church steeples pierced the sky and sailboats bobbed in the marina like toys in a bathtub. It was the kind of place that appeared in tourism brochures, where families raised their children with a sense of security that came from generations of stability and tradition. The town prided itself on its low crime rate, its excellent schools, and its tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was a place where doors were left unlocked and strangers were greeted with cautious friendliness. A bubble of perceived safety that was about to be punctured by an accusation so explosive it would divide the town along fault lines of belief, gender, and justice. Madison Brooks had lived in Harborview her entire life, born to a prominent local family whose name appeared on plaques at the library and the community center. Her father was a successful real estate developer, her mother a former beauty queen who now sat on the board of every charitable organization in town. Madison was their only child, raised in a sprawling colonial house on Elm Street with every advantage money and social status could provide. She had been homecoming queen at Harborview High, captain of the cheerleading squad, and valedictorian of her graduating class. On the surface, she was the golden girl, beloved and admired, the embodiment of everything the town valued. But beneath the polished exterior, those who knew her well saw something else, a calculating coldness, a need for attention that bordered on pathological, and a frightening inability to accept anything less than complete adoration from everyone around her. After high school, Madison had enrolled at Suffolk Community College, commuting from home while working part-time at her father's real estate office. It was there, in the mundane setting of a coffee shop near campus, that she first encountered Professor James Mitchell. At 38 years old, James was everything Madison's carefully curated world was not. He was an adjunct professor of literature, a published poet with a gentle, contemplative manner, and a reputation for inspiring his students to think deeply about the human condition. He had moved to Harborview 3 years earlier from Boston, seeking a quieter life after a painful divorce, and had quickly become a respected figure on the small campus. He was handsome in an understated way, with graying temples and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and who treated his students with genuine respect and interest. Their first meeting was unremarkable. Madison had approached him in the coffee shop, recognizing him from campus, and struck up a conversation about one of his published poems. He was flattered by her interest, impressed by her intelligence, and utterly unaware that, in that moment, he was being marked as a target by someone who had perfected the art of manipulation. Over the following weeks, Madison began showing up at his office hours, ostensibly to discuss literature and her own aspirations as a writer. She was charming, engaging, and careful to maintain an appropriate student-teacher dynamic, never crossing any lines that might raise red flags. But she was also methodically constructing a narrative, planting seeds that would later bear poisonous fruit. The accusation came like a thunderbolt on a clear day. On the morning of April 15th, Madison Brooks walked into the Harborview Police Department with her mother by her side and filed a formal complaint of sexual assault against Professor James Mitchell. Through carefully orchestrated tears, she told the intake officer a harrowing story of betrayal and violence. She claimed that 3 days earlier, on April 12th, she had gone to Professor Mitchell's office after hours to discuss her final paper. According to her statement, he had locked the door, made unwanted advances, and when she resisted, had forcibly assaulted her. She described the encounter in vivid, traumatic detail, her voice breaking at key moments, her body language that of a shattered victim. Her mother, sitting beside her, wept openly, her hand clutching her daughter's with fierce protective intensity. The officer taking the statement, a young woman named Detective Sarah Chen, listened with a mixture of professional detachment and genuine sympathy, documenting every word of what appeared to be a credible and deeply disturbing allegation. The news spread through Harborview with the speed and devastation of a wildfire. By noon, local news vans were parked outside the police station. By evening, the story had gone regional. The headline, "Beloved Professor Accused of Sexual Assault," splashed across every news outlet and social media platform. The town was stunned, divided almost immediately into two camps. Many rushed to support Madison, organizing rallies and online campaigns with hashtags demanding justice. Others, who knew James Mitchell, found the accusation impossible to believe, pointing to his character, his reputation, and the complete absence of any prior complaints or concerning behavior. The fault lines were drawn, and Harborview, once a model of community cohesion, became a battleground of competing narratives and bitter accusations. For James Mitchell, the accusation was an existential catastrophe that unfolded with nightmarish speed. He was sitting in his modest apartment, grading papers and listening to jazz, when two detectives knocked on his door. The look on their faces told him immediately that something was terribly wrong. When they informed him of the accusation, his first reaction was stunned disbelief. He insisted there must be a mistake, that he had never been alone with Madison Brooks in his office on April 12th, that nothing remotely resembling what she described had ever occurred. But the detectives were not there to debate the facts. They were there to bring him in for questioning, and within hours his carefully rebuilt life began to crumble around him. The interrogation was a grueling 6-hour ordeal conducted in the sterile, windowless confines of Interview Room B at the Harborview Police Department. Detective Chen and her partner, Detective Robert Torres, a veteran investigator with a reputation for extracting confessions, employed every psychological technique in their arsenal. They were not cruel or explicitly accusatory, but they were relentless, circling back to the same questions from different angles, subtly suggesting that it would be better for him to admit what happened, that honesty was his only path forward. James, exhausted and terrified, maintained his innocence with an almost desperate consistency. He had alibis, he insisted. He had been in a faculty meeting until 6 o'clock that evening, then had gone directly home. He provided names of colleagues who could verify his whereabouts, but the detectives seemed less interested in his version of events than in breaking down his denials. The turning point in the interrogation came when Detective Torres placed a photograph on the table, a picture of Madison Brooks taken at the hospital, showing bruising on her upper arms. "Explain this, Professor," Torres said, his voice flat and cold. "Explain why this young woman has injuries consistent with being forcibly restrained if nothing happened." James stared at the photo, his mind reeling. He had no explanation because he had never touched her. But the photograph was damning, a piece of physical evidence that seemed to corroborate her story and obliterate his denials. He asked for a lawyer, his voice barely a whisper, and the interrogation ended. But the damage was done. In the eyes of the investigators, his request for counsel was an admission of guilt. a textbook sign that he had something to hide. The arrest came the next morning, executed with a bureaucratic efficiency that felt like a death sentence. James was booked, fingerprinted, and photographed, the mugshot that would later circulate on every news outlet and social media platform, capturing him at his most vulnerable, unshaven, hollow-eyed, and utterly broken. His bail was set at $50,000, an amount that required him to liquidate his meager savings and borrow from colleagues who still believed in his innocence. When he was finally released, pending trial, he returned not to his apartment, but to a hostile world that had already judged and convicted him. He was immediately placed on administrative leave from the college, barred from campus, and shunned by former friends who feared being associated with an accused sexual predator. His name became synonymous with betrayal, his face a symbol of the hidden dangers that lurked even in the most trusted positions. The community's reaction to the case was swift and polarizing. Support groups for Madison Brooks sprang up almost overnight, organizing vigils and fundraisers to help her with medical and legal expenses. Signs appeared in windows across Harborview reading, "We believe survivors," and "Justice for Madison." The local women's shelter held a press conference, with its director, Patricia Hawkins, standing beside Madison and her mother, declaring that this case represented every woman's nightmare, being victimized by someone in a position of power and authority. The narrative was powerful, emotionally resonant, and seemed to fit perfectly into the broader national conversation about sexual assault and institutional cover-ups. Madison herself became a local celebrity, interviewed on television, and featured in magazine articles as a brave survivor, speaking her truth despite the personal cost. But there was another narrative, quieter but persistent, that circulated among those who knew James Mitchell well. His colleagues at the college, many of whom had worked with him for years, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster he was accused of being. Dr. Eleanor Wright, a professor of psychology who had shared an office suite with James, organized a small group of supporters who began their own investigation, quietly gathering evidence that contradicted key elements of Madison's story. They discovered that the faculty meeting James claimed to attend on April 12th had indeed taken place, and that his presence was documented in meeting minutes. They found security camera footage from the campus parking lot showing James leaving at 6:47 p.m., timing that made Madison's version of events logistically problematic. But their findings were dismissed by many as the desperate attempts of friends trying to protect one of their own, and in the court of public opinion, they gained little traction against the emotional power of Madison's accusations. The legal machinery ground forward with inexorable momentum. The Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, led by Assistant District Attorney Marcus Freeman, took on the case with the zeal of crusaders. Freeman was a rising star in the prosecutor's office, known for his aggressive tactics and his perfect conviction record in sexual assault cases. He saw the Madison Brooks case as a high-profile opportunity to make a statement about the justice system's commitment to protecting victims. And he approached it with the full force of his considerable skill and resources. He announced at a press conference that he would be seeking the maximum sentence if convicted, describing James Mitchell as a predator who had used his position of authority to prey on a vulnerable young woman. The die was cast, and the trial that would determine James Mitchell's fate was set for September. As the summer months passed, James Mitchell existed in a state of suspended animation. He could not work, could not resume his normal life, could barely leave his apartment without being recognized and harassed. Anonymous threats arrived in his mailbox. His car was vandalized. Windows in his apartment were broken. He lost 20 pounds, developed insomnia, and found himself spiraling into a depression so deep it bordered on suicidal ideation. His attorney, a competent but overworked public defender named Robert Caldwell, tried to prepare him for trial, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. There was Madison's credible, emotional testimony. There were the photographs of her injuries. There was the forensic evidence, trace DNA that Madison claimed came from the assault. And most damaging of all, there was the simple, powerful narrative of a young woman with no motive to lie versus a man with everything to lose. What James did not know, what no one knew except Madison Brooks herself, was that the entire accusation was a fabrication, a carefully orchestrated lie, born not from trauma but from rejection and narcissistic rage. The truth was far more banal and far more chilling than anyone suspected. Madison had developed an obsessive infatuation with Professor Mitchell, interpreting his kindness and professional attention as romantic interest. She had convinced herself that they shared a special connection, that he was attracted to her, but constrained by professional ethics. When she had finally made her feelings explicit during an office-hour meeting in late March, suggesting they could keep a relationship secret, James had gently but firmly rejected her, explaining that such a relationship would be inappropriate, and that he valued her as a student and nothing more. For most people, this rejection would have been embarrassing, but ultimately insignificant. For Madison Brooks, whose entire self-worth was built on being desired and admired, it was an intolerable narcissistic wound that demanded revenge. The bruises photographed at the hospital had been self-inflicted, created by Madison gripping her own arms with vicious intensity and pressing against the edges of furniture until the tissue bloomed with purple and yellow. The DNA evidence came from a coffee cup James had used in the campus cafeteria, which Madison had carefully retrieved and preserved. Every detail of her story had been meticulously crafted, researched through online forums and true crime documentaries, calibrated to be believable and consistent with genuine assault narratives. She had studied the psychology of trauma, learning to mimic the emotional responses that would make her seem credible. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar, delivered with absolute conviction, because Madison had convinced herself that she was the real victim, victimized by his rejection, by his failure to recognize how special she was, by a world that didn't give her what she deserved. The only person who knew the truth was Madison's best friend since childhood, Ashley Martinez. Ashley had been there in the days after the rejection, had listened to Madison's increasingly unhinged rants about Professor Mitchell, and had watched with growing horror as Madison began plotting her revenge. Ashley had tried to talk her out of it, pleading with her to let it go, to move on, to recognize that what she was planning would destroy an innocent man's life. But Madison had been unmoved, her face cold and determined as she explained that Professor Mitchell needed to learn that he couldn't reject her without consequences. Ashley had been sworn to secrecy, bound by years of friendship and Madison's veiled threats about what would happen if Ashley betrayed her. So Ashley had kept silent, watching the nightmare unfold, guilt and fear warring within her as she witnessed the systematic destruction of James Mitchell's life. The trial began on a humid September morning, the courthouse surrounded by protesters holding competing signs. Believe women on one side, innocent until proven guilty on the other. The courtroom itself was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching from a video feed in an adjacent room. Madison Brooks arrived with her parents, dressed in a conservative gray dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her makeup minimal. She looked young, vulnerable, and entirely credible as she took her seat on the prosecution's side of the room. James Mitchell sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit, his face gaunt and aged beyond his years, flanked by his attorney and a handful of loyal colleagues who had refused to abandon him. Jury selection had been a contentious process, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for any biases that might color their judgment. Marcus Freeman sought empathetic jurors who would respond to Madison's emotional testimony, while Robert Caldwell looked for skeptical, analytical thinkers who would demand concrete proof beyond a reasonable doubt. After 4 days of questioning, a jury of 7 women and 5 men was seated, their faces impassive as they prepared to hear a case that had already been litigated extensively in the court of public opinion. Judge Patricia Clarkson, a stern but fair jurist with 20 years on the bench, took her seat and called the court to order, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The trial of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus James Mitchell had officially begun. Marcus Freeman's opening statement was a masterclass in emotional advocacy. He painted a vivid portrait of Madison Brooks as an exemplary young woman, intelligent, ambitious, trusting, who had been betrayed by a man she admired and respected. He described in carefully measured but devastating detail the events of April 12th as Madison had reported them, his voice heavy with controlled anger as he recounted the alleged assault. He explained that the evidence would show a clear pattern of predatory behavior, that Professor Mitchell had systematically groomed Madison, building her trust before exploiting it in the most violent way imaginable. He pointed to the physical evidence, the bruises, the DNA, and promised that by the end of the trial, the jury would see James Mitchell for what he truly was, a predator hiding behind a facade of gentleness and academic respectability. It was a powerful opening, and several jurors were visibly moved, their faces set in expressions of anger and sympathy. Robert Caldwell's opening statement was more subdued, the presentation of a man fighting an uphill battle against a tidal wave of public sentiment. He acknowledged that sexual assault was a serious crime that deserved serious investigation and prosecution, but he urged the jury to remember that in America, every defendant was presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He promised that the evidence would show significant inconsistencies in Madison Brooks' timeline, that Professor Mitchell had verifiable alibis for key portions of the evening in question, and that there were alternative explanations for every piece of physical evidence the prosecution would present. He asked the jury to set aside their emotions and focus solely on the facts, to question every assumption, and to demand that the prosecution meet its burden of proof. It was a competent opening, but it lacked the emotional resonance of Freeman's performance, and as Caldwell returned to his seat, he could sense the jury's skepticism. The prosecution's case unfolded with devastating efficiency over the next week. Freeman called a parade of witnesses who established Madison's character and credibility, teachers who described her as an exemplary student, friends who testified about her emotional state in the days following the alleged assault, and her parents, who sobbed openly as they described finding their daughter traumatized and broken. The nurse who examined Madison at the hospital testified about the injuries documented in the photographs, explaining that the bruising pattern was consistent with forcible restraint. A forensic analyst testified about the DNA evidence found on Madison's clothing, confirming it matched Professor Mitchell's genetic profile. Each witness added another brick to the wall of evidence, and by the end of the prosecution's case in chief, James Mitchell's guilt seemed all but certain. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was, of course, Madison Brooks herself. She took the stand on the 5th day of trial, wearing a simple navy dress and minimal makeup, her hair loose around her shoulders. As Freeman gently guided her through her testimony, Madison delivered a performance that was nothing short of extraordinary. Her voice broke at appropriate moments. Her eyes filled with tears as she recounted the alleged assault. She described her fear, her confusion, her desperate attempts to resist, all delivered with a raw authenticity that was utterly convincing. She made eye contact with the jury, her expression one of wounded vulnerability, silently pleading for them to believe her, to validate her suffering. It was a masterful display of emotional manipulation, and its effect on the courtroom was palpable. Several jurors wiped away tears. Members of the gallery wept openly. Even Judge Clarkson seemed moved, her usually stern expression softening with sympathy. Throughout Madison's testimony, James Mitchell sat at the defense table, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He was not weeping from guilt, but from the sheer helplessness of watching a lie destroy him. From the knowledge that no matter what he said or did, this jury was inclined to believe her. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of support that felt utterly inadequate in the face of such orchestrated destruction. The prosecution rested its case the following day, and the weight of the evidence seemed insurmountable. Robert Caldwell had alibis, had security footage, had character witnesses, but none of it seemed to matter against the emotional power of Madison Brooks' testimony. The defense's case was a study in frustration and futility. Caldwell called the colleagues who had attended the faculty meeting with James on April 12th, all of whom confirmed his presence until after 6 o'clock. He presented the security camera footage showing James leaving campus at 6:47 p.m., 20 minutes before Madison claimed the assault began. He called a forensic expert who testified that the DNA evidence could easily have been transferred through indirect contact, a shared doorknob, a borrowed pen, any number of innocent interactions. But Freeman's cross-examinations were brutal, systematically undermining each defense witness, suggesting they were biased friends trying to protect a colleague, pointing out gaps in the security footage that could accommodate alternative timelines, and ridiculing the defense's DNA theory as desperate speculation. The critical moment came when Caldwell called James Mitchell to testify in his own defense. It was a risky move, as defendants often damaged their own cases under cross-examination, but Caldwell felt he had no choice. The jury needed to hear directly from James, needed to see the man behind the accusations and judge his credibility for themselves. James took the stand looking frail and exhausted, his voice barely above, a whisper as he was sworn in. Under Caldwell's gentle questioning, he told his story clearly and consistently. He had never been alone with Madison Brooks on April 12th. He had never made inappropriate advances toward her or any student. The accusations were false, though he had no explanation for why she would lie. He was a soft-spoken, credible witness, but he lacked the emotional intensity of Madison's testimony, and his very gentleness seemed to work against him, making him appear evasive and calculating. Marcus Freeman's cross-examination of James Mitchell was a systematic demolition. He asked pointed questions about James's divorce, implying without stating that it had involved infidelity. He questioned why James couldn't account for every minute of his evening if he had nothing to hide. He forced James to admit he had found Madison attractive, twisting the admission into something sinister. Most devastatingly, he asked James why, if he was innocent, Madison Brooks would put herself through the trauma of a trial, would subject herself to public scrutiny and character assassination, would risk her reputation and her future. James had no answer because the question was unanswerable without calling Madison a liar, and doing so would only make him appear callous and victim-blaming. He left the stand looking defeated, and the defense rested its case the following day, its narrative of innocence buried under the weight of Madison's performance. Closing arguments were a mere formality. Freeman delivered a passionate summation that brought several jurors to tears, while Caldwell's appeal to reasonable doubt fell on ears deafened by emotion. The jury retired to deliberate at 3:15 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was once again packed as the jury filed in, their faces grim and determined. The foreperson handed the verdict form to the clerk, who read it aloud in a clear, steady voice. On the charge of aggravated sexual assault, we, the jury, find the defendant, James Mitchell, guilty. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Madison Brooks collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing with what appeared to be relief. James Mitchell simply stared straight ahead, his face blank, as if his soul had already left his body. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and the intervening time was a blur of media coverage and public reaction. Madison gave tearful interviews, thanking the jury for believing her and expressing hope that her case would encourage other survivors to come forward. Advocacy groups held rallies, celebrating the verdict as a victory for victims everywhere. James Mitchell, now a convicted felon, was held without bail, pending sentencing, confined to a county jail cell where he existed in a state of catatonic despair. His attorney filed motions for a new trial, arguing that the verdict was against the weight of the evidence, but Judge Clarkson denied them all. The system had spoken, and James Mitchell was now officially a rapist in the eyes of the law. The sentencing hearing was brief and brutal. Judge Clarkson, after hearing victim impact statements from Madison and her family, sentenced James Mitchell to 15 years in state prison, the mandatory minimum for aggravated sexual assault. As the sentence was pronounced, James finally broke, collapsing in his chair and sobbing uncontrollably, pleading his innocence to a courtroom that had long since stopped listening. He was led away in shackles, his life effectively over, his name permanently inscribed in the sex offender registry, his future reduced to a cage and the label of predator. Madison Brooks walked out of the courthouse flanked by supporters, her face radiant with vindication, her performance complete. For 6 months, James Mitchell rotted in prison, his appeals grinding through the courts at a glacial pace. He was assaulted twice by inmates who viewed sex offenders as the lowest form of life. He spent weeks in solitary confinement for his own protection. He wrote letters to anyone who would listen, maintaining his innocence with an increasingly desperate fervor that his attorney warned would hurt his appeal. His mental state deteriorated to the point that prison psychologists placed him on suicide watch. Meanwhile, in Harborview, life returned to normal. Madison Brooks resumed her studies, became a spokesperson for sexual assault survivors, and was featured in a documentary about her experience. She had achieved the attention and validation she craved, built on the ruins of an innocent man's life. But guilt, even when suppressed, has a way of metastasizing. Ashley Martinez had kept Madison's secret through the investigation, the trial, and the conviction, but the weight of it was crushing her. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not look at herself in the mirror without seeing a coward who had allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned. She had watched Madison's media appearances with growing horror, seeing the glee beneath the practiced sorrow, recognizing that her friend was not a survivor, but a monster wearing a survivor's mask. The breaking point came when Ashley saw a news report about James Mitchell's suicide attempt in prison, his face bruised and hollow, his eyes empty of hope. She realized that her silence was not protecting her friend. It was enabling a psychopath. Ashley's decision to come forward was not sudden but gradual, an accumulation of small moral reckonings that finally outweighed her fear. She started documenting everything she remembered: Madison's conversations before the accusation, her admissions about creating the bruises, her cold calculations about how to make the story believable. Ashley wrote it all down in a detailed statement, knowing that coming forward would destroy her own life almost as thoroughly as James Mitchell's had been destroyed. She would be vilified as a traitor to survivors, attacked by the same advocacy groups that had championed Madison, possibly even charged as an accessory after the fact. But she could no longer live with the alternative. On a cold February morning, Ashley Martinez walked into the office of the Massachusetts Innocence Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to exonerating the wrongly convicted. She carried with her a file folder containing her handwritten statement, text messages she had preserved from Madison, and a recording she had secretly made 3 weeks earlier when she had confronted Madison one final time, asking her to tell the truth. In that recording, Madison had laughed, actually laughed, at the suggestion that she should recant. "He should have wanted me," Madison had said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. "He should have appreciated what I was offering. Instead, he humiliated me. He deserves everything he got." It was the confession Ashley needed, the proof that would vindicate her decision to betray her friend. The attorney who met with Ashley that morning was Linda Huang, a veteran civil rights lawyer who had spent her career fighting wrongful convictions. As she listened to Ashley's story and reviewed the evidence, Linda felt the familiar mixture of rage and heartbreak that came with discovering a miscarriage of justice. She immediately contacted the district attorney's office and James Mitchell's appellate attorney, and within 48 hours, the case that had seemed closed was blown wide open. A motion for a new trial was filed, and an emergency hearing was scheduled before Judge Clarkson. The media, which had been so eager to cover Madison's story, now descended on the courthouse with even greater intensity, sensing a dramatic reversal in a case that had become a symbol of the Austin Me Too era. The emergency hearing was scheduled on a Tuesday morning, and the courthouse was once again besieged by protesters, though the composition had changed dramatically. Many of those who had championed Madison now stood in confused silence, unsure what to believe, while James Mitchell's supporters, who had been dismissed and ridiculed for months, filled the courtroom with cautious hope. James himself was transported from prison, looking gaunt and broken, barely recognizing the people who had fought so hard to save him. Madison Brooks sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, her carefully constructed mask beginning to show cracks, her eyes darting nervously between the judge, the prosecutors, and the doorway through which Ashley Martinez would soon enter. Linda Huang's presentation to the court was systematic and devastating. She first introduced Ashley Martinez's sworn affidavit, detailing Madison's confession that the assault had never occurred, and that the entire accusation had been fabricated as revenge for a romantic rejection. She then played the recording, Madison's cold, mocking voice filling the courtroom. "He should have wanted me. He deserves everything he got." The effect was seismic. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutors sat in stunned silence. Judge Clarkson's face went from skeptical to horrified as she listened to the recording, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly falling into a terrible, clear pattern. Madison herself went pale, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her carefully maintained composure evaporating as she realized that her secret had been exposed. Marcus Freeman, the prosecutor who had so zealously pursued James Mitchell's conviction, rose to address the court, his face ashen. He did not defend Madison Brooks. He did not argue that the evidence should be rejected. Instead, in a remarkable moment of professional integrity, he stood before Judge Clarkson and said, "Your Honor, having reviewed the new evidence, the Commonwealth can no longer maintain confidence in the conviction obtained in this case. We move to vacate the judgment and dismiss all charges against James Mitchell." It was an extraordinary admission, a prosecutor essentially acknowledging that he had sent an innocent man to prison, and it spoke to the overwhelming nature of Ashley's evidence. There was no way to spin this, no way to argue that Madison was still credible in the face of her own recorded confession. Judge Clarkson did not hesitate. "Motion granted," she said, her voice heavy with something that might have been regret or anger or both. "Mr. Mitchell, you are hereby released immediately. The conviction is vacated, and all charges are dismissed." She turned her gaze to Madison Brooks, who sat frozen in her seat, and added, "Miss Brooks, I'm ordering you to remain in this jurisdiction. I expect the district attorney's office will be very interested in speaking with you about potential criminal charges for perjury, filing false reports, and obstruction of justice." It was the judicial equivalent of a death sentence, delivered with cold precision, and Madison's carefully constructed world collapsed in that instant. The immediate aftermath was chaos. James Mitchell, barely able to comprehend that he was free, was surrounded by his supporters, all of them weeping with relief and rage. Media crews rushed to get footage of him leaving the courtroom, no longer a convicted rapist, but an exonerated, innocent man. Madison Brooks tried to flee, but she was intercepted by detectives who read her rights and placed her under arrest, charging her with felony perjury and false reporting. The image of her being led away in handcuffs, her face contorted in rage and disbelief, became the new defining photograph of the case, replacing the earlier images of her tearful testimony. Ashley Martinez, the woman who had saved James Mitchell, slipped out a side entrance, knowing that despite doing the right thing, she would face her own reckoning from a public that doesn't easily forgive those who complicate their narratives. The reversal sent shockwaves far beyond Harborview. It became a national story, covered by every major news outlet, debated endlessly on social media and cable news programs. The case was held up by some as evidence of the dangers of believing accusers without sufficient corroboration, while others argued it was an outlier that shouldn't undermine the broader principle of supporting survivors. The victims' advocacy groups that had championed Madison struggled to respond, some apologizing for the rush to judgment, others doubling down on their support for believing accusers while acknowledging that false accusations, though rare, do occur. The local prosecutor's office launched an internal investigation into how they had so completely failed to vet Madison's story, and Marcus Freeman, despite his integrity in reversing course, ultimately resigned under pressure. For James Mitchell, exoneration did not equal restoration. He was free from prison, but the damage to his life was permanent and profound. He had lost 6 months, his job, his reputation, his savings, and nearly his sanity. He filed a lawsuit against Madison Brooks and the town of Harborview for malicious prosecution and civil rights violations, eventually settling for an undisclosed amount that could never truly compensate for what had been taken from him. He developed PTSD, suffering from nightmares and panic attacks, unable to be in rooms alone with women without experiencing crippling anxiety. He could never teach again, his career destroyed by the mere accusation regardless of the exoneration. He moved away from Harborview to an undisclosed location, seeking anonymity and a chance to rebuild some semblance of a life from the ashes Madison Brooks had left behind. The criminal case against Madison Brooks moved forward with the same inexorable momentum that had once targeted James Mitchell. But where James had maintained his innocence with quiet dignity, Madison fought back with every tool at her disposal. She hired an expensive defense attorney, a high-profile media lawyer named Jonathan Reeves, who immediately launched a public relations campaign painting Madison as mentally ill, as a troubled young woman who needed treatment, not punishment. The strategy was transparent but not entirely ineffective. It raised just enough doubt about her culpability to make the prosecution's job more difficult. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Ashley's testimony, the recording, forensic analysis showing her injuries were self-inflicted, and a digital trail revealing her extensive research into false accusation tactics before filing her report. The trial of Madison Brooks began almost exactly 1 year after James Mitchell's wrongful conviction. The courtroom dynamics were now reversed. Where Madison had once sat at the prosecution's table as the alleged victim, she now sat at the defense table as the accused perpetrator. The judge assigned to the case was Judge Thomas Brennan, a no-nonsense jurist known for his intolerance of courtroom theatrics. The jury selection process was even more contentious than in the Mitchell trial, as both sides sought jurors who could set aside their feelings about the broader political implications of the case and focus solely on the evidence of Madison's criminal conduct. After a week of questioning, a jury of 8 women and 4 men was seated, their faces reflecting the weariness of a community exhausted by this case. The prosecution, now led by Senior Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison, opened by systematically laying out the timeline of Madison's lie. She presented evidence of Madison's obsessive behavior toward Professor Mitchell before the false accusation, including screenshots of social media posts Madison had deleted but which had been recovered by forensic analysts. She showed the jury private messages Madison had sent to friends describing elaborate fantasies about a relationship with Professor Mitchell, messages that predated any actual interaction with him. Morrison presented testimony from forensic pathologists who demonstrated that the bruises photographed at the hospital were inconsistent with assault but perfectly consistent with self-infliction, showing the jury comparison images that made the difference unmistakable. She walked the jury through Madison's internet search history from the weeks before the false report, a damning digital trail that included searches for "How long does DNA last?", "How to make bruises look real," and sexual assault victim behavior. Morrison's case was methodical and clinical, devoid of the emotional appeals that had characterized the original trial. She was building not a narrative of a victimhood, but a portrait of calculation and malice. She called technology experts who testified about Madison's deletion of incriminating evidence, showing that she had used specialized software to try to permanently erase her search history, an act that demonstrated consciousness of guilt. She presented the coffee cup that Madison had retrieved and preserved, showing the jury the meticulous planning that had gone into creating false DNA evidence. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of Madison's defense, and by the end of the first week of trial, the jury's faces showed not sympathy, but growing disgust at the scope of the deception. But the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the moment everyone had been waiting for, came on the 8th day of trial when Ashley Martinez took the stand. The courtroom fell into complete silence as she was sworn in, every eye fixed on the young woman who had chosen conscience over friendship. Ashley was pale and visibly trembling, her voice barely audible as Rachel Morrison began her direct examination. She testified about her lifelong friendship with Madison, about the warning signs she had noticed over the years, Madison's inability to handle rejection, her need to be the center of attention, her casual cruelty toward anyone who crossed her. Ashley described in painful detail the days after Professor Mitchell's rejection, when Madison had spiraled into a rage-fueled obsession, vowing to make him pay for humiliating her. Ashley's testimony was devastating in its specificity. She recounted conversations where Madison had explicitly discussed her plan to fabricate an assault allegation, where she had practiced crying in the mirror to perfect her performance, where she had tested different methods of creating realistic-looking bruises. Ashley testified that she had begged Madison to reconsider, had warned her that she was about to destroy an innocent man's life. But Madison had been unmoved, even excited by the prospect of the attention and sympathy she would receive. The jury listened in rapt attention as Ashley described watching the trial, seeing Madison's performance on the stand, and knowing that every tear, every tremor in her voice, every seemingly spontaneous emotional break had been rehearsed and calculated. It was the testimony of someone confessing their own moral failure, and its raw honesty was impossible to dismiss. The most damning moment came when Morrison played the recording Ashley had made, Madison's voice once again filling the courtroom with its cold, mocking tone. But this time, the context was entirely different. The jury was not hearing the voice of a victim, but of a perpetrator, and the effect was chilling. "He should have wanted me," Madison's recorded voice said with icy clarity. "He rejected me like I was nothing, like I was just another stupid student. He needed to learn that you don't humiliate Madison Brooks without consequences. I gave him exactly what he deserved. And honestly, watching him fall apart has been the most satisfying thing I've ever experienced. Seeing him cry on the stand, that was perfect. That was justice." The recording continued for several more minutes, Madison's words growing increasingly vindictive and self-satisfied, her complete lack of remorse on full display. As the recording played, Madison Brooks sat at the defense table, her face a shifting landscape of emotions. Unlike Ethan Walker, who had maintained his smirk until the very end, Madison's mask was fracturing in real time. She tried to maintain her composed, innocent expression, but flashes of rage kept breaking through, her jaw clenching, her hands balling into fists, her eyes narrowing with hatred as she stared at Ashley on the witness stand. Her attorney, Jonathan Reeves, sat beside her, looking like a man who knew his ship was sinking and there was nothing he could do to bail it out. He had prepared a defense based on mental illness and diminished capacity, but the recording made it clear that Madison had been fully aware of what she was doing and had taken active pleasure in the destruction she caused. Throughout Ashley's testimony, Madison's behavior became increasingly erratic. She whispered urgently to her attorney, loud enough that nearby jurors could hear fragments. Protests that Ashley was lying, that the recording was taken out of context, that she was being betrayed by someone she had trusted. When Ashley described the moment, she realized she had to come forward. When she saw the news report of James Mitchell's suicide attempt, Madison let out a derisive snort that echoed in the silent courtroom. Judge Brennan immediately fixed her with a stern glare and warned, "Miss Brooks, you will control yourself or you will be removed from this courtroom. Do you understand?" Madison nodded, but her expression was one of barely suppressed fury, her true nature becoming more visible with each passing moment. The cross-examination of Ashley Martinez was Jonathan Reeves's best opportunity to salvage his client's case, and he attacked with everything he had. He portrayed Ashley as a jealous friend, someone who had always lived in Madison's shadow and saw an opportunity to destroy her. He questioned the legality of the recording, suggesting it had been obtained under duress. He painted Ashley's decision to come forward as self-serving, an attempt to write herself into the story as a hero when she had been complicit in the lie for months. But Ashley weathered the assault with quiet dignity, acknowledging her own guilt in remaining silent but refusing to back down from the essential truth. Madison Brooks had fabricated the entire accusation, and an innocent man had been imprisoned because of it. The jury seemed unmoved by Reeves's attacks, their sympathies clearly with Ashley, the flawed witness who had ultimately done the right thing rather than with Madison, whose every reaction seemed to confirm her guilt. The defense's case was a desperate exercise in damage control. Jonathan Reeves called a parade of mental health experts who testified that Madison suffered from borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and a host of other psychological conditions that impaired her judgment and impulse control. They painted a picture of a young woman whose brain chemistry and developmental trauma had created a perfect storm of maladaptive behavior. The strategy was to acknowledge that Madison had made the false accusation, but to argue that she was not fully responsible for her actions, that she was, in her own way, a victim of her own psychological pathology. It was a more sophisticated version of the defense that had failed Ethan Walker, an attempt to replace moral culpability with medical diagnosis. But the prosecution's cross-examination of these experts was surgical. Rachel Morrison forced each one to admit that personality disorders do not eliminate a person's ability to distinguish right from wrong, that Madison's elaborate planning and evidence fabrication demonstrated clear criminal intent, and that millions of people with similar diagnoses managed to navigate life without destroying innocent people. She asked each expert a devastating question. Doctor, if personality disorders excuse this kind of behavior, then where do we draw the line? At what point does someone with a diagnosis become responsible for their choices? None of them had a satisfactory answer, and their testimony, meant to elicit sympathy, instead reinforced the image of Madison as a calculating manipulator who was now trying to use mental illness as a shield from accountability. Reeves's final gambit was to call Madison's parents to testify, hoping they could humanize their daughter and appeal to the jury's compassion. But the strategy backfired spectacularly. Madison's mother, Madison Brooks, took the stand and delivered testimony that seemed more concerned with protecting the family's reputation than with her daughter's fate. She spoke of Madison's accomplishments, her intelligence, her promise, but she could not bring herself to address the enormity of what Madison had done. When Morrison asked her directly, "Mrs. Brooks, has your daughter ever apologized for what she did to James Mitchell?" Catherine hesitated, her face flushing, before quietly admitting, "No, she hasn't." The answer hung in the air, a damning indictment not just of Madison, but of the environment that had created her. Madison's father, Richard Brooks, was even more problematic for the defense. He was angry, defensive, and unwilling to acknowledge that his daughter had done anything wrong beyond making a mistake in judgment. He blamed Professor Mitchell for leading Madison on, blamed Ashley for betraying his daughter, blamed the media for destroying their family's reputation. His testimony was a masterclass in deflection and denial, and the jury watched him with visible distaste. When Morrison asked him if he believed his daughter should face consequences for sending an innocent man to prison, Richard Brooks actually said, "I think both of them made mistakes, and both of them should move on." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Brennan had to call for order. It was the moment the jury saw where Madison's sense of entitlement came from, the environment that had taught her that consequences were for other people. The prosecution's rebuttal case was brief but devastating. Morrison called James Mitchell to the stand, the first time he had been in the same room as Madison Brooks since his exoneration. He walked to the witness stand slowly, his gait that of a much older man, his face still bearing the haunted look of someone who had been to hell and barely made it back. Morrison asked him simple questions about the impact of the false accusation on his life. He spoke quietly about the 6 months in prison, the assaults he had endured, the suicide attempt that had nearly succeeded. He described the loss of his career, his savings, his reputation. He talked about the nightmares that still woke him every night, the inability to trust anyone, the permanent damage to his psyche. He was not dramatic or emotional in his delivery. He simply recited the facts of his destruction with the flat affect of someone who had been broken beyond repair. When Morrison asked if he had any message for the defendant, James Mitchell finally looked directly at Madison Brooks for the first time. She stared back at him with undisguised contempt, her lip curling in a sneer that she didn't bother to hide. "I don't understand why," James said, his voice cracking slightly. "I was kind to you. I tried to be a good teacher. I never did anything to deserve this. You took everything from me, my freedom, my career, my health, my future. And for what? Because I didn't return your romantic interest? Because I had the audacity to maintain professional boundaries?" He paused, tears now streaming down his face. "I hope you get the help you need, but more than that, I hope you spend a very long time thinking about what you did and how many lives you destroyed because you couldn't handle being told no." It was a powerful moment, the confrontation between victim and perpetrator, and several jurors were openly weeping. Throughout James Mitchell's testimony, Madison Brooks' behavior crossed from inappropriate to shocking. She rolled her eyes repeatedly, shook her head in exaggerated disbelief, and at one point actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of derision that caused Judge Brennan to slam his gavel and issue a final warning. But the most telling moment came when James broke down in tears, his shoulders shaking as he described the suicide attempt. Madison leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and smiled. It was not a smirk or a nervous reaction. It was a genuine smile of satisfaction, visible to the jury and to everyone in the courtroom. Her attorney grabbed her arm, hissing something urgent in her ear, but the damage was done. The mask had not just slipped. Madison had deliberately removed it, revealing the cold, pitiless creature beneath. Closing arguments were a stark contrast in tone and substance. Jonathan Reeves delivered a passionate plea for mercy, arguing that while Madison had committed terrible acts, she was still a young woman whose life could be salvaged with proper treatment and rehabilitation. He urged the jury to see her as a cautionary tale about untreated mental illness rather than as a monster, to remember that punishment should serve rehabilitation, not mere vengeance. It was a well-crafted argument, delivered with genuine emotion, but it foundered on the simple fact that Madison herself had shown no remorse, no insight, and no indication that she was capable of rehabilitation. Reeves was asking the jury to imagine a version of Madison Brooks that simply did not exist. Rachel Morrison's closing argument was brief, powerful, and devastating. She recapped the evidence systematically, building an inescapable case that Madison had deliberately and maliciously fabricated a serious criminal accusation for no reason other than wounded pride. But then she shifted her focus from the facts to the implications. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "false accusations like Madison Brooks don't just destroy individual lives. They undermine the credibility of every real survivor who comes forward, every genuine victim who needs to be believed. They give ammunition to those who want to dismiss all accusations as lies. They poison the well of justice for everyone. Madison Brooks didn't just betray James Mitchell. She betrayed every person who has ever been assaulted, every person who has ever had to find the courage to report their victimization. She weaponized their trauma for her own selfish purposes, and in doing so, she made the world a more dangerous place for real survivors." Morrison then pointed directly at Madison, her fingers steady and accusatory. "Look at her," she commanded. "Look at the defendant. Throughout this trial, you have seen her true character on display. She has shown no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the magnitude of what she has done. She has smirked, laughed, and sneered at the suffering of the man she nearly destroyed. She is not a victim of mental illness. She is not a troubled young woman who needs help. She is a calculating, malicious predator who used the justice system as a weapon to satisfy her own narcissistic rage. The only question before you is whether we, as a society, will hold people like her accountable for the devastation they cause." It was a mic drop moment, and as Morrison returned to her seat, the jury's expressions made clear they had already reached their verdict. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, a longer period than in James Mitchell's wrongful conviction, but still remarkably swift for such a complex case. When they returned, their faces were set in expressions of grim determination. The foreperson handed the verdict forms to the clerk, and Judge Brennan read each count aloud. On the charge of perjury, guilty. On the charge of filing a false police report, guilty. On the charge of evidence tampering, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. With each guilty verdict, Madison's face grew paler, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. By the time the final verdict was read, she was shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the reality of consequences, real, permanent consequences, finally penetrated her narcissistic armor. But the true unraveling came at sentencing 3 weeks later. Unlike James Mitchell's sentencing, which had been swift and brutal, Madison's was a drawn-out affair as both sides presented arguments about the appropriate punishment. The prosecution sought the maximum sentence on each count, arguing that Madison's actions and her complete lack of remorse warranted the harshest penalty the law allowed. The defense pleaded for leniency, for probation with mandatory mental health treatment, arguing that imprisoning Madison would serve no legitimate penological purpose. Judge Brennan listened to both sides with his characteristic stern patience, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When it came time to deliver the sentence, Judge Brennan did something unusual. He spoke directly to Madison Brooks, requiring her to stand and face him. "Miss Brooks," he began, his voice cold and hard, "I have been on this bench for 18 years. I have sentenced murderers, rapists, child abusers, and every variety of criminal the law recognizes. But I have rarely encountered a defendant whose actions were as calculated, as malicious, and as utterly devoid of justification as yours. You did not commit your crimes in a moment of passion or desperation. You did not act out of necessity or even out of greed. You destroyed a man's life. You nearly ended it because he had the audacity to reject your romantic advances. You weaponized an accusation of sexual assault, one of the most serious charges our society recognizes, to satisfy your wounded ego." Judge Brennan's voice grew harder, colder as he continued. "Your behavior throughout this trial has been appalling. You have shown no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the gravity of your actions. You have smirked and laughed at the pain of your victim. You have treated these proceedings as an inconvenience rather than as the reckoning you so richly deserve. Your parents' testimony revealed the environment that created you. A world where you were taught that you were entitled to whatever you wanted and that consequences were for other people. But that world no longer exists for you, Miss Brooks. Today you enter the real world, where actions have consequences and where the justice system does not bend to your will." The judge then delivered the sentence, and it was crushing in its severity. On the perjury charge, 5 years in state prison. On the false reporting charge, 3 years to run consecutively. On the evidence tampering charge, 2 years consecutive. On the obstruction charge, 2 years consecutive. In total, 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of early release. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps and applause, quickly silenced by Judge Brennan's gavel. It was a sentence that exceeded what many legal experts had predicted, a clear message that the court would not tolerate the weaponization of false accusations. Madison Brooks stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her brain unable to process the reality that she would spend the next 12 years of her life behind bars. And then, just as it had with Ethan Walker, the mask finally and completely shattered. Madison let out a sound that was half scream, half sob, a primal wail of rage and self-pity that echoed through the courtroom. "This isn't fair," she shrieked, her voice raw and desperate. "He should have wanted me. He should have appreciated me. This is all his fault. All of it." She lunged toward the prosecution table, where James Mitchell sat, her face contorted with hatred, her hands reaching for him as if she could somehow finish what she had started. The bailiffs tackled her before she got within 10 feet, wrestling her to the ground as she continued to scream incoherently, her carefully constructed facade of innocence replaced by the raging, entitled monster she had always been beneath the surface. As Madison Brooks was dragged from the courtroom, still screaming threats and obscenities, the assembled crowd sat in stunned silence. They had just witnessed the complete psychological collapse of someone who had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, someone whose narcissism was so profound that even in the face of overwhelming consequences, she could not accept responsibility for her actions. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked entitlement, about the damage that can be done when someone is taught that their wants matter more than other people's rights, about the poison of narcissism when it is nurtured rather than corrected. The cameras captured every moment of Madison's breakdown, and the footage would be replayed endlessly on news programs and social media, becoming a symbol of accountability, finally catching up with privilege. In the aftermath of the sentencing, Harborview began the long process of healing and reckoning. The town that had been so quick to condemn James Mitchell now grappled with its collective guilt, forced to confront how easily they had been manipulated by a skilled performer. The victims' advocacy groups that had championed Madison issued careful statements, acknowledging their mistake while trying to maintain that false accusations remain rare and that the principle of believing survivors should not be abandoned because of one spectacular fraud. It was a difficult balance, and not everyone was satisfied with the responses. Some argued that the Madison Brooks case proved the danger of "believe all women" rhetoric, while others insisted that it was an outlier that shouldn't undermine support for genuine victims. The debate raged on, bitter and polarizing, long after Madison began serving her sentence. For James Mitchell, Madison's conviction and imprisonment brought a measure of justice but not peace. The vindication was important, the formal acknowledgement that he had been wronged, that his innocence had been established beyond any doubt. But it could not undo the damage. He could not get back the 6 months he spent in prison, the career he loved, the sense of security and trust he once had in the world. He would carry the psychological scars for the rest of his life, forever marked by an accusation that, despite being proven false, would always be the first thing people thought of when they heard his name. He eventually settled his lawsuit for a substantial sum, money that provided financial security, but felt like an inadequate exchange for what had been taken from him. He moved to another state, changed his name, and tried to build a new life in anonymity, haunted always by the ghost of what had been done to him. Ashley Martinez, the unlikely hero of the story, faced her own complicated aftermath. While some praised her courage in coming forward, others vilified her for not speaking up sooner, for enabling Madison's lie for as long as she did. She received death threats from people who believed she was a traitor to survivors. She was ostracized by former friends who couldn't reconcile their loyalty to Madison with Ashley's betrayal. She moved away from Harborview, enrolled in a different college, and tried to rebuild her life under the weight of her own guilt and the judgment of others. She had done the right thing, but the right thing had come at a tremendous personal cost, and she would spend years in therapy working through the moral complexity of her choices and their consequences. Madison Brooks herself entered the state prison system as inmate number 847392, stripped of her name, her identity, and the privilege that had defined her entire existence. The institution did not care that she had been homecoming queen or valedictorian. Her beauty, which she had weaponized so effectively in the outside world, made her a target in an environment where vulnerability was exploited without mercy. She was placed in protective custody after being assaulted by inmates who, like those who had targeted James Mitchell, had their own rough justice for those who filed false accusations. She spent 23 hours a day in a cell that barely larger than a closet, her world reduced to concrete and steel and the endless, crushing monotony of institutional life. In prison, Madison was required to participate in rehabilitative programming, including intensive therapy sessions designed to address her personality disorders and her criminal behavior. But the therapist quickly discovered what everyone else already knew. Madison Brooks was fundamentally resistant to genuine self-reflection or change. She could perform remorse when she thought it would benefit her, could say the right words when parole might someday be on the line, but beneath the performance, she remained convinced that she was the real victim. In her mind, James Mitchell had wronged her first by rejecting her, and everything that followed was merely evening the score. She was incapable of genuine empathy, incapable of understanding that other people were real, complete human beings with their own dignity and rights. She was, in the clinical language of her psychological evaluations, a textbook narcissist with antisocial features, her personality disorder so deeply entrenched that treatment was unlikely to produce meaningful change. The case had broader implications that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. It became a touchstone in debates about sexual assault, due process, and the balance between believing survivors and protecting the accused. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing the case, discussing how the justice system had both failed and ultimately succeeded. Failed in initially convicting an innocent man based on a credible but false accusation, but succeeded in eventually correcting that error when new evidence emerged. The case was taught in law schools as an example of the complexities of he said, she said cases, and the importance of thorough investigation before rushing to judgment. It was cited in debates about mandatory minimum sentences, about the role of personality disorders in criminal behavior, and about the unintended consequences of well-meaning social movements. The Madison Brooks case also sparked a renewed conversation about the phenomenon of false accusations and their impact not just on the accused, but on genuine survivors. Victims' advocates acknowledged that while false accusations remain statistically rare, estimates suggest they account for between 2 and 10% of all reports. Each case like Madison's creates disproportionate damage to the credibility of real survivors. The case became a teaching moment about the importance of thorough investigation, of distinguishing between supporting survivors and automatically assuming guilt, of recognizing that the pursuit of justice requires careful weighing of evidence rather than reflexive belief or disbelief. It was an uncomfortable conversation that many people on all sides of the issue would have preferred to avoid, but it was a necessary one. Years later, when documentarians and journalists sought to tell the complete story of the Madison Brooks case, they uncovered additional troubling details about her past. Former classmates came forward with stories of Madison's pattern of manipulation and false accusations that stretched back to middle school, claiming teachers had said things they hadn't, accusing classmates of bullying that never occurred, fabricating stories to gain sympathy and attention. Her parents had consistently covered for her, threatening legal action against anyone who challenged her version of events, creating an environment where Madison learned that lies were effective tools and that she could escape consequences through her family's social capital. The pattern had been there all along, visible to anyone willing to look, but everyone had been too intimidated, or too willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, to intervene before the lies escalated to life-destroying proportions. The question that haunted everyone who studied the case was whether Madison Brooks could have been stopped earlier, whether there was an inflection point where intervention might have altered her trajectory. Mental health professionals who reviewed her history suggested that aggressive treatment in early adolescence, when her personality was still forming, might have made a difference. But they also acknowledged that personality disorders, especially those with narcissistic and antisocial features, are notoriously difficult to treat, particularly when the individual lacks insight into their own pathology. Madison had been taught from birth that she was special, that the normal rules didn't apply to her, that her feelings mattered more than other people's rights. Unlearning those lessons, assuming it was even possible, would require a level of self-awareness and humility that Madison had never displayed, and perhaps was neurologically incapable of developing. As Madison Brooks' 12th year of imprisonment approached, she would be eligible for parole, and the question of whether she would be released became a subject of intense public interest as Bassett debate. The parole board would have to weigh her institutional behavior, her participation in treatment programs, and the risk she posed to public safety against the possibility of rehabilitation. But those who had studied her case closely had little hope that she had fundamentally changed. Narcissists of her severity rarely experienced genuine transformation, and the prison environment, with its emphasis on compliance and external control, did nothing to address the core pathology that had driven her crimes. The most likely outcome, experts predicted, was that Madison would remain exactly what she had always been, a predator capable of mimicking remorse, but incapable of feeling it, waiting for her next opportunity to manipulate and destroy. The Madison Brooks case stands as a stark reminder that justice, while necessary, is rarely satisfying. James Mitchell was exonerated, but the years stolen from him could never be returned. Madison Brooks was imprisoned, but her victim's suffering continued long after her cell door closed. Ashley Martinez did the right thing, but carried the weight of her initial silence forever. The community learned a painful lesson about the dangers of rushing to judgment. But the divisions created by the case never fully healed. There were no winners, only varying degrees of loss, and the only certainty was that the damage done by one person's narcissistic rage would echo through multiple lives for decades to come. In the end, the story of Madison Brooks is not just about a false accusation or a wrongful conviction. It is a story about the corrosive power of unchecked entitlement, about what happens when someone is raised to believe they are the center of the universe, and that other people exist merely as supporting characters in their narrative. It is a story about the danger of confusing sympathy with justice, of allowing emotional responses to override careful reasoning. It is a story about the importance of courage, embodied by Ashley Martinez, who chose truth over loyalty even when it cost her everything. And ultimately, it is a story about consequences, how they shape us, how we avoid them, and how, eventually, they catch up with us all. Madison Brooks walked into that courtroom believing her beauty, her tears, and her performance would save her. She walked out in shackles, finally understanding that the real world does not bend to narcissists' wills, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, ultimately arrives for those who believe themselves above it. The case of Madison Brooks serves as a chilling reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a beautiful face and speaks with a trembling voice. Sometimes it hides behind tears and vulnerability, weaponizing our compassion and our desire to protect the vulnerable. The most dangerous predators are not always the ones who look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the person you'd least suspect, the golden girl, the victim, the one everyone wants to believe. But this case also reminds us of something equally important. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of emerging. It took courage, the courage of one woman who chose conscience over comfort. But eventually, the light found its way through the darkness. James Mitchell's nightmare ended not because the system was perfect, but because someone was brave enough to speak when silence would have been easier. That is the lesson we must carry forward. As we close this chapter of a story that shattered lives and divided a community, we're left with uncomfortable questions that have no easy answers. How do we balance believing survivors with protecting the innocent? How do we create space for genuine victims to come forward, while guarding against those who would exploit that space for malicious purposes? How do we recognize the difference between someone who needs our support and someone who seeks to weaponize it? These questions don't have simple solutions, and perhaps that's the point. Justice is not a slogan or a hashtag. It is a careful, painstaking process that requires us to hold multiple truths in tension, to support survivors while demanding evidence, to show compassion while maintaining skepticism, to believe in the best of humanity while guarding against the worst. Today, Madison Brooks sits in a prison cell, her beauty faded, her youth spent behind bars, her name forever synonymous with deception. James Mitchell lives under an assumed name, rebuilding a life from fragments, forever changed by an ordeal that should never have happened. Ashley Martinez carries the weight of her choices, both the silence and the speaking, knowing she did the right thing but unable to forget how long it took. And somewhere, in courtrooms and communities across the country, similar stories are unfolding, each one a reminder that the pursuit of justice is never simple and the cost of lies is always higher than we imagine. The mask of innocence has been removed. The truth has been told. And in the end, that may be the only justice that truly matters. Not perfect outcomes, but the unwavering commitment to seek truth wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter whose narrative it destroys. Because in a world where lies can destroy lives, the truth, however painful, remains our only reliable compass, pointing towards something resembling justice. This has been the story of Madison Brooks, the woman who thought she could manipulate the justice system, who believed her performance was flawless, who learned too late that some masks, once removed, can never be put back on. May her story serve as both warning and inspiration, a warning to those who would weaponize accusations for personal gain, and an inspiration to those who, like Ashley Martinez, find the courage to speak truth, even when silence seems safer. Justice, as they say, may be blind, but it is not, as Madison Brooks discovered, fooled forever.